Welcome to the Deep Dive, where we deliver the crucial context and surprising details you need to be truly well-informed. Today we are strapping on our sandals and taking a trip back to, well, probably the most intense civic arena of the ancient world, the Athenian courtroom.
That's right.
Our mission is to really deep dive into the harrowing legal system of classical Athens, focusing entirely on the experience of the citizen who stood accused. And this is a world where justice was pretty much synonymous with personal confrontation. The stakes were, frankly, existential.
And right at the start, we have to sort of reset our modern understanding of law enforcement. When we discuss justice today, we automatically think of a state-run system, right? An institutional force, a public prosecutor pursuing crime.
Sure, the DA, the Crown Prosecution Service, that kind of thing.
Ancient Athens had no such thing, nothing like it. The entire absolutely crushing burden of initiating a prosecution and then also mounting a defense, well, that fell completely upon private citizens.
Wow, so the whole system was basically built from the ground up to be a personalized fight.
Precisely. That meant the legal process was inherently agonistic. Deeply confrontational, competitive, because it relied entirely on one private individual initiating litigation against another. The trial itself was, well, overwhelmingly viewed as an organized, almost legalized continuation of personal hostility.
Hostility, like a feud.
Exactly the word. They called this ekthra. It means feud or enmity, and this concept is crucial.
Okay, ekthra. So we're not talking about cool-headed judges dispassionately applying statutes here.
Not really, no.
We're talking about essentially weaponized personal hatred playing out in front of hundreds of your peers.
That's a very good way to put it. It absolutely blurred the lines between formal legal action and private retribution. It made every single trial this incredibly high-stakes psychological battle, and a rhetorical one, too.
It sounds like an ordeal, just utterly draining.
It was an ordeal. And the core question that really defines our deep dive today is this. In this legal ecosystem where, as you said, the distinction between legal action and personal violence was often razor thin, how did that constant threat that required public performance test the mettle of the citizen standing accused? It truly was an endurance test for your reputation, your property, and sometimes your very life.
Okay, let's really unpack this concept of ekthra then. Because our sources seem to make it incredibly clear that this wasn't just some ancient custom lingering in the background. It was a practical reality. Violence and law were, what, interchangeable tools.
That's perhaps the most shocking takeaway for, our modern sensibility. In classical Athens, if you developed serious enmity ekthra with another citizen, you essentially had two broad avenues of action.
Okay.
And you could choose between them, or even switch back and forth. You could pursue that hostility through outright physical violence, or you could pursue it through litigation.
So the legal process itself was fundamentally understood as, well, just another way to carry on the feud.
Exactly. An act of feud conducted within a certain framework, but feud nonetheless.
So what were the sort of constraints on that choice? And if the law didn't necessarily stop violence, why would someone even choose the courtroom over, say, just beating someone up?
Well, it was a strategic choice. It really depended on the outcome you wanted, and crucially, the support you thought you could get from your fellow citizens, the potential jury. Violence might bring immediate satisfaction, right? Reverse some perceived dishonor, but it also carried big risks. Retaliation, maybe even counter-litigation if you went too far.
Right.
Litigation, on the other hand, while potentially very draining financially and emotionally, it offered the possibility of the state actually sanctioning the destruction of your enemy.
State-sanctioned destruction. Wow.
Yeah, through massive fines, financial ruin, exile, even death, if you could convince the jury. So the system didn't really remove the option of violence. It just provided a potentially more effective and, importantly, a publicly endorsed method for conducting your feud.
Okay, so it's another weapon in the arsenal.
Yeah.
And you mentioned the high stakes that was made even worse by just how many different legal avenues were available. The consequences could vary wildly.
Exactly right. The Athenian legal system was characterized by what scholars often call its open texture. What that means is there was a really substantial diversity of procedures available to address almost any unlawful act.
So not just one way to sue someone.
Oh, far from it. And the severity of these different procedures varied wildly. That ensured the stakes were constantly incredibly high.
Can you give us a sense of that spectrum, like from the lowest stakes up to the most serious?
Sure. So At the, let's say, the lower end, you actually had procedures that carried absolutely no financial or corporal penalty for the defendant, even if they were technically convicted, but they were still vital for political maneuvering.
How does that work? No penalty.
Take the probole, for example. Demosthenes famously used this against Midias.
Okay, a probole. What exactly was that?
It was essentially a kind of preliminary hearing or maybe a public denunciation. You'd bring it before the assembly, usually about some kind of public wrongdoing or insult.
So more like political theater.
Well, yes, it definitely had elements of political theater, but it was strategically essential. Crucially, the accuser didn't risk financial penalties if they failed to get enough votes, unlike in many other types of prosecution where failing could cost you dearly.
Ah, okay. Lower risk for the accuser.
Right. It allowed a private citizen to sort of test the political waters, gauge public opinion against an enemy before deciding whether to launch a far more costly and risky full legal suit, like a graffe, a public indictment. It was a way to, start the feud cautiously.
Like dipping your toe in the water to check the temperature of popular wrath.
That's a perfect analogy. Precisely. Right. Okay, so moving up the scale, you had actions that resulted in fines. Things like the dike kategorias for slander. The aim there was financial damage, obviously, but also public shaming.
Still serious, but not life-threatening.
Generally not, no. But then the stakes leap dramatically. We get into corporal punishment or what amounted to civil death.
Exile.
Exile. That sounds devastating in a society like Athens.
It was catastrophic. Exile was the statutory penalty in a graphi traumatos ek pronoias, that's wounding with premeditation. To be exiled meant the complete destruction of your civic identity, loss of property, being cut off from your community, your gods, everything.
And then the ultimate penalty, death.
Which was, constantly on the table in certain cases. Death was an available punishment in the graphi hybrios. Hybris, outrage, gross insult, violation of another's honor in a profound way.
Yeah.
And death was actually mandatory in the context of apagoge. That was a summary arrest procedure, often used for, say, thieves caught red-handed or other kinds of designated criminals, sometimes political enemies too, under the right circumstances. The point is, the accuser chose the procedure.
The accuser chose the potential punishment range.
Exactly. And that choice defined the entire scope of the accused citizen's potential ruin right from the outset. It's just fascinating because, as we said at the start, the state wasn't really using its monopoly of force for dispute resolution in the way we think of it. So, if the state wasn't the strong arm, what was the system actually for?
Well, in many ways, the system actively encouraged self-help. It was built on the recognition that citizens, particularly heads of households, had to manage their own honor and grievances.
So it expected citizens to step up themselves?
Yes. And this encouragement sometimes took on very specific, almost ritualized, extravagant, and often expressive forms, particularly when sexual honor was involved.
The famous examples involving adultery, we hear about those.
Yes, and the source material on adultery is very clear here. The violence that often ensued was frequently extrajudicial. It wasn't typically a punishment mandated by a court after a trial.
So not technically legal.
Actually, under certain circumstances, it was legally permissible. It was a private act undertaken by the offended party, usually the husband, but sanctioned by law if the adulterer was caught in flagrante delicto. And it was designed, quite symbolically, to subordinate the adulterer and, crucially, reverse the dishonor that the transgression had inflicted upon the household.
So it was formalized vengeance almost, permitted vengeance.
You could definitely see it that way. It was personal violence operating within a recognized, if frankly chilling, social and legal framework. The law didn't say, you must bring this adultery case to us to resolve. It said, under these specific conditions, you are legally justified in acting personally and violently to restore your honor.
Okay. That really drives home the point.
So when an accused citizen walked into that courtroom, you have to understand, they weren't just facing a technical charge sheet. They were facing the organized, formalized, and potentially legalized personal fury of an enemy. An enemy who, under different circumstances, might have just as easily resorted to sanctioned private violence. The legal system, in this sense, was often an extension of war by other means, not necessarily a way of stopping it.
So if private citizens face these kinds of existential threats from personal feuds, ecthra, playing out in court.
Yeah.
What about public officials? When we move from a dike, a private suit, to public accusations against generals or statesmen, the stakes must have become truly terrifying.
Oh, absolutely. They were, as one source memorably describes the Athenian electorate, austere masters of their statesmen.
Austere masters.
Oh,
I like that.
It captures it well. The citizens demanded, and sometimes pretty unreasonably expected, near-perfect success from public figures, especially officials like generals, the Stratego, who commanded the army and navy. They inevitably held enormous sway over foreign relations and military outcomes.
And if the outcome was poor, a lost battle, a diplomatic failure, the citizens didn't just shrug and blame fate or bad luck.
Not typically, no. When things went badly, a city allied to Athens was lost, a naval expedition was defeated, or Athens was somehow humiliated on the international stage, that failure was often seen as a direct reflection on the leadership. And therefore, an injury to the entire polis, the city-state itself.
Which made political life inherently incredibly high risk.
Completely. Accountability wasn't like an annual performance review. It was a constant, potentially life-or-death scrutiny by the assembly and the popular courts.
The idea that you could become a scapegoat almost overnight seems, well, terrifyingly real here. Can you walk us through maybe the ultimate illustration of this? I'm thinking of the tragic fate of Callistratus.
Ah, Callistratus. Yes, his story is a chilling encapsulation of how quickly and how decisively sustained popular opinion could determine a citizen's fate, irrespective sometimes of the initial legal technicalities.
So who was he? What happened?
Callistratus was a prominent, generally seen as quite able statesman in the mid-4th century BC. His troubles really began with this kind of smoldering discontent in Athens after the capture of Oropus. Oropus was this border territory, strategically important, and its loss caused friction.
Okay, a political setback.
Right. And it reflected broader dissatisfaction with how Athens was managing its affairs at the time. Now, Callistratus was initially associated with the policies around Oropus.
And he survived the first challenge, didn't he?
He did. That's a crucial point. He was actually indicted over the Oropus affair, brought to trial. But importantly, he was acquitted. He managed to navigate that first wave of popular anger successfully. He argued his case, presumably convincingly, and survived that specific accusation. It shows the system could grant reprieve.
So it wasn't automatically fatal?
Not automatically. However, his ultimate fate seems to have been sealed by a subsequent, incredibly high-profile humiliation inflicted upon the city, something that really hit Athenian pride hard.
This was the raid on the Piraeus, Athens' own port.
Exactly. Alexander of Pherae, this Thessalian tyrant, executed a shocking, absolutely brazen raid right on the Piraeus, Athens harbor.
Wow, how did that even happen?
It speaks to a moment of vulnerability, perhaps naval unpreparedness. But the effect was profound. This wasn't just a distant military setback. It was a deep public insult delivered right at the very heart of the democracy, visible to everyone. A humiliation.
I can imagine the fury.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And this single act of profound injury, our sources say, excited the popular wrath to such a pitch that the citizens basically looked around for someone to blame. And their gaze fell on the previously acquitted Callistratus, along with the admiral who had failed to prevent the raid. They were both condemned to death in absentia.
So it wasn't really about a specific new crime Callistratus committed, but more the cumulative effect. The public frustration just boiled over and needed a target.
That seems to be exactly it. The court, acting as the embodiment of the people's will, condemned him based on this sustained, heightened sense of outrage and humiliation. He only escaped immediate execution because he managed to flee into exile, apparently to Macedonia.
But the story doesn't end there, does it? The really horrifying part comes later.
No, it doesn't. Years later, perhaps hoping the intense popular wrath had finally subsided, he made the fateful decision to return to Athens.
Why would he risk that?
Perhaps homesickness, perhaps a miscalculation, believing time had healed the wounds. He sought refuge upon his return at the altar of the 12 gods in the Agora.
The most sacred place of sanctuary in the city.
Arguably, yes. A place specifically designated for suppliants where theoretically the gods themselves offered protection. It was a powerful symbolic gesture. But the sources are stark. They reveal that the public's fury that Ecthra felt by the collective citizenry had not abated one bit.
No one spoke up for him.
Apparently not. No one, not a single person, raised a voice to save him or argue for clemency. It's depicted as the ultimate expression of sustained, unforgiving, popular opinion.
And the execution.
It's chilling. The public executioner simply carried out the original decree, right there at the altar. violating the sanctuary. It's a truly striking, dramatic, and frankly terrifying example of how a citizen's survival depended utterly on the fickle, yet potentially sustained, opinion of the demos. An opinion that could completely override legal precedent, acquittal, even claims to divine refuge.
That terrifyingly personal quality, that reliance on popular opinion, it must have made facing any kind of indictment, especially a political one, a necessary contest of character. It required this exhausting public performance.
Absolutely.
And the confrontation you sometimes read about between Demosthenes and Aeschines, two major rival politicians, seems to bring this to life perfectly.
It really does. That rivalry, played out in the courts and the assembly, highlights exactly how the line between, say, a financial audit, euthanasia, and a full-blown political impeachment could simply vanish. Well, in one famous instance, Demosthenes is prosecuting Aeschines, and he accuses Aeschines not just of specific wrongdoing, but fundamentally of lying, of betraying the public trust, of falling out of public favor. Demosthenes explicitly stresses that Aeschines is only undergoing a mere audit when, in Demosthenes' view, he rightly deserved impeachment, Aisangelia, long ago.
So he's framing the whole legal proceeding not as, like, checking the books,
Not at all.
but as a fundamental judgment on Aeschines' moral and political fitness to even be a citizen.
Precisely. Aeschines was forced, in that moment, to defend not just his accounts, but his entire political career, his entire character, his loyalty to Athens.
And the pressure must have been immense.
Acute. We actually have Aeschines' own account, or at least what's presented as his account in his speeches, where he describes Demosthenes allegedly threatening him during the proceedings.
Threatening him how?
Aeschines claims Demosthenes basically said that if Aeschines tried to hide, cover his face in shame or shrink away from the confrontation on the platform, Demosthenes himself would come and uncover me and lead me to the platform and force me to answer.
Wow, that image. Being physically dragged up to defend yourself.
It's such a potent illustration of the coercion, the compulsion inherent in Athenian public life, especially during legal battles. You couldn't just hide your shame or refuse to participate. You were compelled, physically if necessary, to stand exposed before the people.
Literally naked before your accusers and the jury.
It's the ultimate psychological test, isn't it? You're dragged out, you're exposed, and you're forced to perform a defense of your entire existence before the very same people, potentially, who had just condemned Callistratus to die at the altar. The trial, especially for a public figure, was the place where their life and all the financial, social, civic privileges that came with it was either emphatically confirmed or utterly demolished. And often, that verdict hinged less on the specific legal charge and much more on the overall perception of their character, their history, and their perceived loyalty to the state. #Check3. The personalization of legal strategy, the accused defense.
Okay, so given that the prosecution was often, as you said, essentially legalized extra personal feud playing out in court, the defense strategy had to be equally personalized, right? The accused needed to somehow deflect this idea that they were acting out of some premeditated malice, some long-running malicious feud.
That's absolutely right. If the prosecution could successfully paint the alleged crime as stemming from pre-existing enmity, ekphra, then the defendant was seen as far more culpable. It suggested calculation, malice aforethought.
So proving lack of premeditation was key.
Crucial. Therefore, especially in homicide cases, you see the defendant's primary rhetorical labor, a huge amount of effort in their speech, dedicated to proving they acted on the spur of the moment.
Spur of the moment. How so?
They'd argue it was out of momentary passion, perhaps an accident, maybe justifiable self-defense, or in defense of honor, anything other than a cold, calculated act of retaliation stemming from some pre-existing hatred or feud.
It sounds like a very conscious, structured legal defense strategy, specifically designed to counter the concept of feud itself.
Oh, it was entirely structured that way. We see it clearly in the speeches. Take Euphilides, the speaker in Lysias's first oration. He's defending himself after killing a man he caught in bed with his wife.
The classic adultery case.
Exactly. And he goes to enormous lengths, spends a lot of his speech trying to prove to his jury that his actions were necessitated by the immediate situation, the defense of his household honor in that moment, not as revenge for some prior dispute. He works hard to establish there was no ekthera beforehand.
And he wasn't the only one.
No. Similarly, you have Euxethius in Antiphon's fifth oration, another homicide case. He offers extensive disclaimers throughout his speech, really laboring the point to ensure his actions aren't misconstrued as the result of some premeditated malicious ekthera. They were actively, consciously trying to mitigate the powerful political and legal implications of perceived premeditation rooted in feud.
Okay, so controlling the narrative of intent was vital. But you also mentioned earlier just the simple choice of how you appeared in court or if you appeared voluntarily seemed to be a significant strategic move in itself.
Yes, that was another vital piece of the character defense puzzle. An accused individual could choose to appear voluntarily for their defense. A key example is Eratosthenes.
Eratosthenes. He was one of the 30 tyrants, right? After Athens lost the Peloponnesian War.
That's him, one of the ruling oligarchs during that brutal, short-lived regime. After the democracy was restored, many of the 30 faced reckoning. Eratosthenes chose to appear voluntarily to defend himself at his euthanae.
His euthanae, that's the standard audit or review of conduct for officials, right?
Yes. Although in the context of the 30, it was much more than a standard audit, it was a trial for his life. But the voluntary nature of his appearance, which Lysias, his prosecutor, actually points out, was significant.
What was the significance? Why make a point of showing up willingly?
Well, it allowed Eratosthenes to try and seize control of the narrative from the start, to claim a kind of moral legitimacy. Appearing voluntarily stood in stark contrast to, say, being dragged there, or worse, being subject to that summary arrest procedure we mentioned, apagoge.
Ah, the summary arrest.
Right. Apagoge inherently implied compulsion, maybe flight, certainly guilt in the public eye. By willingly submitting himself to the audit, to the public scrutiny, Eratosthenes was essentially making a statement. I am confident in my character. I have nothing to hide. I stand here as a citizen submitting to the city's processes.
So it was an attempt to preempt the accusation that he was a coward, a fugitive, someone acting outside the norms.
Exactly. A strategic choice aimed at defending his fundamental character and right to participate, even as someone accused of terrible crimes.
That really underscores how psychological the whole process was. But maybe the most devastating strategy available, particularly for the prosecutor, was what you called the broader indictment, turning a single charge into a trial of the defendant's entire life, their political history, their associates.
Yes. And this is where the Athenian courtroom really proved its, well, devastating capacity for character assassination. It often rendered the specific legal charge almost secondary to the larger political and moral narrative being spun.
And the Eratosthenes case is a prime example of this, too.
Absolutely. Lysias 12, the speech against Eratosthenes, is a masterclass in this technique.
So remind us, what was Eratosthenes specifically accused of in that trial? What was the actual charge?
The technical charge, the basis for the euthanae turning into a capital trial, involved Eratosthenes' alleged role in the arrest and subsequent execution of Lysias' own brother, Polemarchus, during the reign of the 30 tyrants, a very serious charge.
Okay, complicity in murder, essentially.
Yes, but here's the striking thing. When you actually read Lysias' speech, he dedicates, as scholars have noted, comparatively few words to the killing of his brother.
Comparatively few words. When it's about his brother's murder, that seems remarkable.
It is. Instead of focusing solely on Eratosthenes' specific actions in that event, Lysias concentrates his enormous rhetorical energy, his skill as a speechwriter, on constructing this sweeping general indictment of the entire 30 tyrants' oligarchy, their reign of terror, their philosophy, their impact on Athens.
So he puts the whole regime on trial.
Pretty much. He actually spends significantly more time attacking the character and history of Theramenes, another prominent member of the 30, but one who was actually executed by the 30 and had little direct role in Polemarchus' death than he does attacking Eratosthenes himself on the specifics of the charge.
Why Theramenes?
Theramenes was a controversial figure, seen by some as a moderate, by others as a traitor. By attacking Theramenes, Lysias could tarnish anyone associated with the regime, including Eratosthenes, and tap into existing political divisions and resentments.
So he used Eratosthenes as a kind of stand-in, a symbol for the whole hated oligarchy.
Exactly. Lysias frequently speaks of the defendants in the plural, even though only Eratosthenes is technically on trial in this speech. He effectively puts the entire memory, the ideology, the collective guilt of the oligarchy on trial, not just the single man standing before the jury.
Wow. So the trial becomes less about, did Eratosthenes do this specific thing, and more about, was Eratosthenes part of that, and should that be condemned?
Precisely. It transformed a specific homicide case into this massive political showdown, a referendum on loyalty, civic commitment, reputation, and the entire traumatic legacy of the 30. It perfectly highlights the character-driven, politically charged nature of the Athenian legal battle.
Which really confirms that the whole thing was less about, forensic fact-finding, and much more about establishing whether the accused possessed the necessary
Yeah.
civic honor
Yeah.
to deserve the protection of the polis.
That's a good way to frame it. It was fundamentally a judgment on their inherent moral worth as a citizen, their perceived loyalty, their contribution or lack thereof to the city's well-being.
Yeah.
However,
Yes.
even a flawless history of public service wasn't a universal shield. It didn't grant you immunity.
Right. Past good deeds didn't automatically present bad ones.
Demosthenes makes this point very clearly in one of his speeches. He explicitly acknowledges that the state had, quite rightly, honored many generous benefactors in the past. Men who had excelled in naval battles, who had captured enemy cities, men who had performed expensive public services, the liturgies, out of their own pockets.
So Athens did value contributions.
Oh, absolutely. Service and benefaction bought significant goodwill, political capital, rhetorical leverage in court. You could certainly point to your past contributions in your defense.
Well,
But Demosthenes emphasized Athens never and would never grant any of them, no matter how distinguished, the license to assault their personal enemies whenever they feel like it.
so no free passes for bad behavior, even for heroes.
Exactly. In other words, while your history of service was definitely scrutinized and it mattered, it did not provide a permanent shield against accountability for personal conduct, especially conduct driven by ecthra, that violated the basic social contract or harmed fellow citizens. The accused was judged by their current actions, viewed in the light of their entire past, yes. But past glory could not simply negate a present crime or transgression in the eyes of the jury. Your character was always under review. #Tag5, psychological pressures and civic obligations.
Okay, so when we put all these elements together, the personalized feud aspect, the ecthra, the compulsory high-stakes public performance, this intense character scrutiny where your whole life could be put on trial, it just culminates in what sounds like a crushing amount of psychological pressure on the accused citizen.
Immense pressure, yes.
They weren't just defending a single action in court, were they? It feels like they were constantly defending their entire existence as a citizen.
That's a very accurate way to put it. They lived in a state of almost constant tension, particularly the wealthy citizens. Think about the financial obligations.
The liturgies and war taxes.
Exactly. The wealthy were perpetually under pressure to meet these incredibly expensive financial duties. The liargi, liturgies, like funding a warship for a year or paying for a dramatic chorus. And the aisphra, the special property taxes levied primarily for war.
And the city's needs were pretty much insatiable, especially during wartime.
Right. Athens was frequently at war, so the city's needs were vast, and the obligation to fund them fell disproportionately on the rich, directly threatening their individual personal fortunes. There was an inherent conflict there.
It sounds like it created a system where demonstrating your devotion to the city could be financially ruinous.
It certainly could be, and that fundamental tension, that potential conflict between private interest and public duty, was mirrored in military obligations as well.
Military service.
Yes. While Athenian culture absolutely prized patriotic ideals, heroism in battle, dying for the city, the sources also frankly acknowledged that the motivation and indeed the opportunity for draft evasion were real.
People didn't want to die, basically.
Understandably, citizens rationally feared for their lives on the battlefield, and the sources suggest that the wealthy or politically powerful were often, quote, better positioned to evade conscription through personal influence.
So they could pull strings to get out of it.
It seems so, though options apparently existed even for average citizens, perhaps fabricating grounds for exemption like a sudden illness or urgent family matters. There's a constant push and pull.
So this creates a really deeply contradictory environment, doesn't it? The city demands total devotion, your money, your life, but the individual is constantly trying to navigate personal survival, wealth retention, family needs, and maintain their civic honor all at the same time.
Absolutely. It's a complex balancing act.
And the trial, then, becomes the ultimate public assessment, the place where the city judges how well you manage that contradiction throughout your life.
It really was the final crucible in many ways. The outcome of a citizen's trial, especially a major public trial, determined their ultimate fate, their property, their family standing, their entire civic status. Were you judged to be a devoted citizen worthy of the polis's protection and inclusion? Or were you deemed a corrupted element, a liability, perhaps even an enemy within?
And if you were condemned,
Your political standing was obviously ruined. Often your property was confiscated by the state. Your family could suffer disgrace. The ruin was immediate, public, and total. This intense scrutiny, this focus on the citizen, the overall worthiness, it really speaks to a fundamental moral logic underpinning Athenian thought. a logic we even see articulated dramatically in their tragedies.
You mean the idea of the double bind? That crops up in discussions of Greek tragedy. Tell us more about how that ancient moral tension might have manifested itself in the courtroom ordeal.
Right, the double bind. It's this powerful idea that sometimes you're trapped in a situation where any action you take is potentially wrong. To punish a wrong might require you to commit another wrong. Yet not to punish that initial wrong is also a form of wrongdoing, a failure of duty or justice.
Classic example being Orestes.
Exactly. The most famous literary example is Aeschylus's Orestia. Orestes is following a divine command from Apollo to avenge his father Agamemnon's murder by killing his mother Clytemnestra. But in doing so, he must commit matricide, one of the most profound wrongs imaginable. He's trapped between conflicting moral imperatives, divine command versus primal taboo. There's no clean way out.
Okay, so how does the Athenian legal system, with its ekthra and public performance, force the accused citizen into a similar kind of impossible choice?
Well, the system, by being so reliant on personal initiative and public judgment, forces the accused, and indeed the accuser too, to navigate this kind of ethical quagmire under intense public duress. Consider the accused person who has suffered a wrong. If they fail to prosecute their enemy, if they don't pursue the ekthra through litigation or other means, they risk being seen by their peers as weak, dishonored, maybe even an incomplete citizen, failing in their duty to uphold justice and their own family's standing.
So inaction is wrong.
Potentially, yes, in the eyes of the community. But if they do prosecute, especially if they do so aggressively, or if they bring a case and then lose, they risk escalating the ekthra to a truly ruinous level. They might provoke devastating counterattacks, financially or physically. They might be seen as malicious or overly litigious themselves.
So action is also potentially wrong, or at least dangerous. Damned if you do, damned if you don't.
In a way, yes. The accused is perpetually trapped between the societal demand for accountability, for honor, for pursuing justice, and the very real personal danger of destruction that pursuing it entails in this agonistic system.
So surviving the trial wasn't necessarily about finding the objectively right legal answer.
Not always, no.
It was more about surviving the impossible moral and social choice you were forced to make.
Exactly. The citizen's moral worth, their ultimate standing, wasn't judged solely by some internal standard of factual innocence or guilt regarding the specific charge. It was defined, often in real time, right there in the courtroom, by their ability to convince hundreds of their peers that they had navigated this double bind, that they had chosen the least offensive path, the path most arguably beneficial or least harmful to the polis.
And they had to perform that convincingly.
Yes, performance was key. Their fate depended entirely on their rhetorical skill, their composure, their perceived character, their psychological endurance in that single, incredibly high-pressure public appearance. It wasn't enough to be factually innocent, assuming they even were. You had to successfully perform that innocence, that justification, that navigation of the moral maze in an environment deliberately designed to be hostile, confrontational, and deeply, deeply personal. It was the ultimate civic ordeal, an ordeal that could define or end a life. #outro. So I think to summarize the key takeaway for you, the listener, today, Athenian justice was just profoundly different from our modern conceptions. You really have to grasp that. It wasn't defined by the cold, supposedly impartial application of abstract law by state professionals.
No public prosecutor, no police force in our sense.
Right. Rather, it was the sustained, dangerous, and highly theatrical contest. A contest of character, of reputation, of connections, and crucially, of rhetorical endurance. Personal enmity, that ekthra, and political accountability were just inseparable forces constantly churning.
So the system itself was designed almost as a test.
You could argue that, yes, its fundamental purpose in many ways seems to have been to test the individual citizen's commitment, their loyalty, their worthiness to the polis through this public ordeal. And that ordeal was focused, often mercilessly, on who you were perceived to be, what you represented politically and socially, and fundamentally, your ability to stand up before your peers, face your enemy, and maintain your civic honor under extreme pressure.
It paints a picture of a historical landscape where the legal system wasn't some distant abstraction, but an ever-present, potentially terrifying threat or opportunity, demanding continuous public performance and self-assertion just to survive as a citizen. We've really seen today that the ordeal of the accused became in many ways the defining feature of Athenian law.
I think that's fair to say.
So, given those incredibly high stakes, and the fact that political and social survival often rested on your ability to perform convincingly in this intensely personal, often hostile arena, What does that do to a society's very definition of justice? When accountability becomes inseparable from personal spectacle, from winning a popularity contest under duress.
Mm.
And maybe a final thought to leave you with. If aspects of our modern world, maybe think about the constant digital media trials by public opinion, the relentless expectation that public figures must perform authenticity and sincerity on demand, 24/7 well, if that's forcing leaders and individuals today to navigate an increasingly high-stakes arena of popular wrath and judgment.
Right.
Are we, in some strange way, inadvertently resurrecting elements of that terrifying Athenian character contest, trading the water clock and the jury box for the glare of the 24-hour news cycle and the social media feed? Something to perhaps ponder as you reflect on who gets to determine justice and how in our own time.